This and all talks at the 2019 JavaScript for WordPress Conference are brought to you in part by our sponsors Pantheon, a high-performance hosting platform with agile developer tools. Check them out at pantheon.io.
Hi, everybody. Thanks again for tuning in. And our next speaker is Ryan Welcher. And he has been a developer for over 15 years, and over the course of his career has had the opportunity to work with many coding languages, frameworks, and technologies. He's currently a lead developer engineer at 10up, where he builds websites and tools for content creators. He's a component maintainer and regular contributor to WordPress core and a contributor to Gutenberg. And with that, I will just hand it over to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So I'll just dive in. I have a ton of stuff to go through, so hopefully we can get through it all. So if my slides are showing, I'll just dive right in. So we have, so I'm here today to talk about the Gutenberg slot fill system. And I want to just give a bit of background as to where this talk came from. I work at 10up, and we were working on one of our plugins, our distributor plugin, and we were looking for a way to show some customized information in the edit screen for distributed information. If you're not familiar with the plugin, it's really cool. It allows you to distribute content across the network. And so we actually started talking we put some pull requests out there and ended up finding out about the slot fill thing. I ended up finding about slot fill. And so we worked with it, and it seemed really, really neat. And then we got it into core. And then fast forward a little bit further, and I was working on an internal project with our UX designers, and we were having a conversation about where can we extend Gutenberg? How can we add things to the editor? Where, what's configurable, what's not? And my answer to all of that was I have no idea, because at that time Gutenberg was fairly new, and we didn't really have all the extension points. And as we all know, Gutenberg and the classic editor don't have a one-to-one parity for all the actions and hooks and filters and stuff. So this talk is basically all the discovery that I and some of my colleagues at 10up did to figure all this stuff out, to see what we can do and how we can extend the Gutenberg editor with the slot fill system. So we'll start with basically the basics. What is slot fill? So slot fill is a new extension paradigm in WordPress. We've had the hooks API forever and on the PHP side. We now have it in the JavaScript side as well. And so this is now another paradigm on top of that. It's not the same as hooks. It's actually very different. But yeah, and so what it actually allows is rendering elsewhere in a React element tree. It's referred to as portal rendering. And I'll talk about that in a bit more detail later on. It was heavily inspired by the React slot fill library, which is out there, and you can go take a look at that. And slots right now are location based. So a slot is in a particular spot in the editor. It's very similar to some of the actions that we had in the classic editor experience. If you've ever tried to put in a subtitle field, there was a particular action, I can't remember the name off the top of my head right now, that you would use, and you could insert stuff in beneath the title field in the classic editor. Jumped ahead. So I have a repository that I've been sort of building slides in and demos and everything. So I'm going to be jumping back and forth between my slides and the repo. So we're going to talk about a basic slot fill system and how that works. So a basic slot fill system is really only comprised of three components. We have a slot component, and that slot component, wherever we render that component, any fills with the same name are going to be rendered. Their content will be rendered inside that slot. So it takes up to three props. The first prop is a string. It's a name, and that's the most important one, because we have to name our slots in order to be able to target them with fills. The second one is fill props, which is an object which we can pass things to the fills through this fill props property. So, and then the third one is bubbles virtually, and this changes the way that the events are handled inside. So if it's false, which is what the default is, I believe the bubbling events just happen through the normal DOM, and if it's set to true, it'll bubble up through the React tree. And I know that that React is working on some stuff right now to do with this that is going to improve the way that some of the internal slots work. So like nesting slots is kind of a bit weird right now. But anyways, so here's a really simple example. So we're just going to pull in slot. It's on the WP components package. And that's literally all you have to do to expose a slot. The second component is a fill component. The contents of this fill will be rendered in the slot with the same name property, regardless of where the fill is rendered. It only takes a single parameter. It's a parameter of name, and that name has to match a slot somewhere. And then the glue, the big one, is slot fill provider. So this component is the glue that connects the fills with their associated slot. So both the slot and fill components must be wrapped inside of slot fill provider in order for that sort of magic connection to happen. It doesn't take any props at all. So here's a very simple, very simple basic slot fill example. So what we have is we're pulling in all the items that we need from the WP components. We have fill slot and slot fill provider. We're wrapping our entire application. This is obviously a bit of pseudocode, but we're wrapping a whole application inside the slot fill provider. Then we're exposing the slot. And then somewhere else in our application, in this case, immediately following, we render a fill. And so when this is actually rendered out, the contents, fill contents, will be rendered into the slot wherever the slot appears. So if you imagine that you had 20 components sitting between slot and fill would be at the very bottom, slot at the very top. When it's rendered, the contents of fill goes where slot is. So if we look at sort of like a graphical representation of this, we have a slot fill provider that's wrapping up our app UI. Over on the left, we have a slot that's exposed. And then we have a couple of fills that are rendered elsewhere. So we have and they're both targeting the slot with the name of my slot name. So when this is actually all rendered, what happens is slot fill provider takes the contents from fill and moves them over to slot. It should be noted that right now it's very much source order driven. There's some stuff that we're working on to getting some priority in there, but it's very much in the pull request phase and kind of figuring that out. The one thing that I do want to call out here is that this is a closed system. So because slot and fill have to be wrapped inside of a slot fill provider, how do we add more? How do we add our custom things inside of that? Because our fills won't be wrapped up inside of that. So that brings me to sort of like, how does Gutenberg do this? Gutenberg has a bit more of a complicated system, obviously. So the Gutenberg slot fill system starts by rendering a slot fill provider in the editor component, and then various slots are exposed in various places inside of the layout component. Now, these component names don't really matter for what we're talking for the sort of thing, but just realize that that's where the stuff is kept. And then our fills are registered using the WP plugins API function called register plugin. And I'm going to talk about that in a bit of detail. But once everything's been registered, another component comes into play called plugin area. And so plugin area accesses all of the registered plugins and it renders them inside a hidden div. And because plugin area is inside of layout, which is inside of slot fill provider, all those fills get connected to all their slots. That's pretty straightforward. So to access the system, we're going to be using register plugin. So actually what's happening behind the scenes in register plugin is that we're accessing an array and we're just adding another settings object to that array. And then the plugin area has access to the same array, and then it just renders all that stuff out inside of a hidden div, and then slot fill provider takes it over from there. So if we look at kind of like a graphical representation of that, we have again our application, our closed application, which has got our slots and our two slot names there, and then we have a plugin area down on the bottom left, and then we inject or we add our plugins by a register plugin, and so that's our entry point. So once we've entered that stuff, plugin area can render whatever is in there. It doesn't care. It just renders whatever's been added, and then when that gets rendered out, it actually takes the contents out of the plugin area and puts them into the individual slots. So let's talk a little bit about the API. And just wait for this to load. Okay, so the WP plugins API, it's used to manage adding and removing plugins that are used in the slot fill system. The big function that we're going to be using a lot today is register plugin. and it's used to register a new plugin by adding it to the internal array that is used by the whole API, but specifically plugin area. So it's got two parameters. It's got a name parameter, which is a string. It must be unique, and it only accepts lowercase alphanumeric characters or dashes and has to start with a letter. Second one is an object, a settings object, where we have a render function. So the render function contains the component that we're going to be rendering. That it contains the UI that's going to be rendered. And then the other property that it has right now is icon. An icon can be a string, it can be an element, or it can be a function returning an element, and it's essentially the icon that's going to be displayed in the UI if it's there. Just to note that some slot fills will actually inherit the icon that is passed by register plugin. Not all do. Some don't need it. Some haven't been wired up to do it. So, when we go through each of them, I'll call those out. So here's a really simple example of using register plugin. So we're going to pull it in from the WP plugins package. We're going to get our first slot fill that we've seen, and I'm just going to mention it. It doesn't look like just a named slot, and we'll talk about that in a bit, but it works the same as wrapping fills. And so we're going to wrap some content in our slot fill, and then we're going to register our plugin with a unique name, pass it the render component and whatever icon we want. In this case, it's the dash icon of smiley. So there's a couple of more API items that we should touch on. So unregistered plugin does the opposite of what we just talked about. You pass it a name and it unregisters that plugin. We have get plugin, which will return the settings object for whatever plugin name you pass. And then there's get plugins, which does that, but for everything. So it returns an array of all plugin settings. All right, so here's the fun part. Now we're going to talk about the slot fills that are actually available. So currently we have 8 slot fills exposed on the WP edit post object. I'm not going to name them all because they're all a mouthful, but we're going to go through each one individually. I want to call out that there's actually more. There's more than 8 slot fills in Gutenberg. There's a bunch, there's a whole lot. There's a lot of internal ones. There's ones that haven't been exposed, they're only used internally. And then there's sort of special ones like inspector controls. I would imagine if you've built a block, you've used inspector controls. That's actually a slot fill, but it's a special type of slot fill that takes a context, an edit context. And so that doesn't really work, at least I haven't been able to get it to work with this register plugin approach. Just a note about the structure. So I'm going to be showing some of the structures of these slot fills. They're not just simple components. They're name components. They usually have other things inside them, other components, and a whole bunch of functionality. This will all become more clear, but I just didn't want the first slot fill to be like, whoa, it looks nothing like what you just said they were going to be. So here's the first one. This is probably the simplest one. It's called PluginPostStatusInfo. And so this adds items into the status and availability panel of the document sidebar. So this is the named component structure. So we see that we have the component. So every slot fill is going to take a children property, and that's going to be the content that's being wrapped. So they all have children. I think 7 of 8 have children. And then there's the potential for other properties being passed. So for example, we're passing a class name here, which actually gets passed to the panel row that's going to wrap whatever content we're putting in there. So we have a single prop. It's called string. It's an optional class name. This does not inherit from register plugin because it doesn't use an icon. And so here's a really basic example. So we're going to pull register plugin out again. We're going to get the slot fill. This is the exact same example that I showed from the previous slide. And if we look to the posts, I have a it's just going to go slow now. Oh, there we go. Sorry, my local machine's a little bit slow there. So I'm just going to pull up a post I have that has an example of all the slot fills. Oh boy. Oh man. Apparently I am on dial-up right now. Great. So here is the so we were showing the post status info. So that is the location right there where any slots, any fills that are added will be displayed. So we'll jump over to the next one. And this is the plugin pre-publish panel. So this adds a custom panel to the pre-published side panel. Again, here's the component structure, pretty straightforward. It's got the children, and then a bunch of other properties that are passed to the panel body that wraps the content. Again, we've got a class name property, which is a string, a title, which is the title of the panel that appears. If you leave the title out, it will just show the panel body, and you won't get the toggle. Initial open is a Boolean, whether or not that panel should be opened or closed when the page loads. This currently does not support, well, doesn't support icon at all, but there's a pull request open to have it support icon and also to inherit icon. So it's pretty simple, or sorry, simple. There's a pretty basic demo here where we're just wrapping some content inside of our component again. And then if I jump over here and I go to publish, you can see that I have a pre-published panel. And that's actually, I'm just gonna make a little change there. So that is actually, if we didn't put, if we didn't put the title in. So if I add a title now, I can say my custom title, right? And just gonna rebuild that real quick. And if we refresh, oh, there we go. Okay, so hopefully this doesn't take an hour to load again. Anyways, I'll move on to the next one while that's taking forever to load. So because the next one is extremely similar to the one that we just looked at. So the next one is called PluginPostPublishPanel. So this is almost functionally exactly the same. The structure is completely the same. The props are the same. It doesn't support an icon, but there is a pull request open. This is very much because slot fill is location specific. So we don't have because we need to have two locations. We're using the contents of the slot fill are all the same, but because we have two locations, we need two slots for that. And so this actually appears after you publish. So now that this is loaded, I will go and show pre-publish. So we have the custom title there, and then we're going to once we publish. Oof. There we go. So now we have the custom post publish panel there as well. After that, we have plugin more menu items. So this is going to put a menu item into the plugins flyout. So this is an example of a slot fill that uses another slot fill. So this is an internal one that's not actually available. So this takes a whole bunch of props, but it also takes kind of an open-ended list of props as well. So it can take an href, which will turn it into an anchor tag instead of a button. We have icon, which will, as we know, it'll display a dash icon or a slug, or an element of some form. We have an on-click function that can be triggered when the user clicks the menu, and then we have props. So the way that props works is any additional props are passed through the underlying menu item because because we need to be able to add those things at times. So it does actually inherit the icon here, and so in our example, you can see that we have an href, and this is a shameless plug for 10up. Come check it out. It's awesome working here. We have an href, and that's mentioned up here, but target and rel are not. So that's where the ... props comes in. So that's going to get passed through, and then when we actually go to look at this thing, which is over here, we can see we have this 10up hiring button. If we click that, it's going to open up this button in a new tab. I'll let that load. There we go. And if we look at the source, if we just take a quick look at the source here, inspect. You can see that my computer is very slow. We can see that we have a target and we have the no refer and all those props were passed down through. So yeah, so sorry, jump through to the next one. The next one is plugin block settings menu item. If you're sensing a pattern with a naming convention, they are long and a mouthful. But so this one is going to add a new menu item like we just sort of did, but to the plugin block settings, but only on allowed blocks. So there's a lot going on in here, but we have another example of an internal slot fill being used inside of this slot fill. So it takes a parameter of allowed blocks, which is an array of the blocks that you want this menu item to appear on. We have the icon again. We have the label. So label is actually the menu text. So this is one of the only slot fills that I'm aware of that doesn't wrap content. So we don't need to wrap it with a string. We just add the label property, and that'll be the label of the menu. And then we have an on-click function. So this doesn't inherit from the register plugin, but it does have a default. So if you don't pass a plugin, it will use the plugin plugins dash icon. So here's an example right here. So what we're doing is we're saying that I only want this to appear on the core paragraph block, and that's the text that I want it to be, and I'm just going to make it do an alert because I am awesome at JavaScript. So if we look at the plugin, the paragraph here, we can see that we have. Eventually, we can see that we have the button here, and if we click that, it's just going to say clicked. And if we click on this. This image, it's not there. So there you go. And this also works if we decide that we like to have the toolbar at the top. It'll also appear. I don't know why it wouldn't, but just to be clear, it does actually show up there as well. So the next one is plugin sidebar. So this is one that's very cool, but is kind of different than what we've seen so far. So so this is the component structure, and it's huge. And I'm not going to try to explain everything that happens in here. But the available props that we have, the first one is a name. So when we use a plugin sidebar, we have to give this thing a name so we can target it. And it has to be unique. The class name is, we've seen that before. It's pretty straightforward. The title is, again, a string. It's the title appeared at the top of the sidebar. We have a Boolean for is pinnable as to whether or not it can be actually pinned up top. And then we have the icon. And so this does actually inherit from register plugin. One thing, I don't have an example here because this can be used by itself, but it's supposed to be used with the next component that I'm going to talk about, because without it, it's possible to unpin this sidebar and not be able to get it back. So without doing like an API call, basically. So I'm going to jump to the next one, and then we'll talk about it. So this is called plugin sidebar more menu item. And this is going to render a menu very similar to the one that we already have talked about. And if you look at the source, it's actually just wrapping up a plugin more menu item. But it's functionally the same thing. It shows in the same place. But what this does is when it's clicked, it's going to actually open up the sidebar, the plugin sidebar that we just talked about. So this only has two properties. It's got a target, and the target has to match the name of the sidebar. And then we have an icon. And it does actually inherit from register plugin. So here's a full example using both. So we have our plugin sidebar here. We have the name of sidebar name, and we give it an icon of smiley, and this is the title, and then this is the content. So we're going to render this text inside a panel body. And then the menu item, menu item then targets this name, and then that's the link for the, that's the text that gets displayed. So if we take a look at what that looks like, we see that this is our item here, right? And if we unpin that and go away, without this button, we wouldn't be able to get that back. So that's why it's good to be used in conjunction there. Okay, so the next one, I'm doing good on time. The next one is a brand new one. We just got this merged last week. Last week. And it's available in the Gutenberg plugin as of version 6.1. So this is called the plugin document setting panel. And this one's really cool because it allows us to put custom panels in the sidebar underneath the status of the availability panel. So up until now, the only way that we've been able to get things in that sidebar is by registering a meta box and setting it to side. And it's kind of a hack. So this actually allows us to get something in there. Excuse me. So we have some sorry, this is the component structure. We can see that here's the fill that we're talking about, and it's got a panel body, and the content is rendered here. So some of the available props, we have the name. So the name is actually used to identify the panel, to allow toggling open and close and have that get remembered. And then we have the class name. We have a title, which shows in the header of the panel, and then we have an icon. So this does inherit from register plugin. So if we don't pass it an icon, it gets it from whatever's passed here. So here's a simple example. So we have register plugin. We have plugin document setting panel. We're pulling that out, and then we're wrapping just some pretty basic content inside of that and registering our plugin. So I can show you that now by trying to click on things. So you can see now we have this custom panel right here with our custom logo, and we can put whatever we need in there. It's a pretty underwhelming example, but there's a pretty great entry point to add some cool things with plugins. So I want to mention that you can combine calls. So everything that we've seen so far has been, well, with the exception of the second last example, has been one slot fill, wrapping content, and then one register plugin call. And you don't have to do that. It took me a little while to figure that out, which is kind of funny. But basically, this plugin that I'm running, which is part of a repository, which I'll share after the talk is over, is using this to pull in all of the stuff. So all I've done is taken the component that I would pass to the render property, and export it, and then pull it in and just render each one of these things out. So one of the benefits is you pass one icon and everything gets that same icon. You don't have to remember how many plugins you have. Everything gets registered at the same time because source order matters. Yeah, so that's just something to keep in mind. So where are we now? Oh, live demo. What can go wrong with a super slow local? So I'm going to talk a bit about, actually, I want to show a real world example. So I have this, I'm going to just do this. I'm going to load up my real world stuff, and I'm going to jump over here, see if I can get this post to load. Oh boy. Okay, so I have this concept for a real world usage, and I'm only using 2 slots, but I think that this really is a great example of how powerful these things can be to really change like your workflow, like pretty significantly. So well, I try to think of things to say while this loads. This is a pre-published checklist, is basically what it is. So it's a pretty sort of simple example. I'm using the plugin PostStatusInfo, and I'm using the plugin pre-publish panel. So I have a post here, and if I look, I'm going to see, so I've added this sort of word count thing here. So this is done with the plugin PostStatusInfo. Now I am aware that you can get the plugins or the words and everything up here, but as I'm typing, I'd like to get a sense of how many words, maybe characters with spaces, whatever we want to put in there. So right now I've got none, so I'm going to type super fast, drop some content in. You can see that it updates pretty quickly. And then, so now I think, oh, okay, this is fine. I'm done. I want to publish. So I'm going to publish this. Now I've hooked in, or I've slot filled into the pre-published checklist, and I've actually set a bunch of parameters. So what I'm doing is I need a minimum word count. I need to use some categories. I need some tags. And I need to have a featured image. Otherwise, the post is locked and I can't publish it. So I'm going to come back and fulfill some of the requirements that I need. I'm just going to go through this quickly. So you can see that I'm going to give it the category. Oh boy, maybe I'll do tags. Well, categories is failing. There we go. Okay, I'm going to add that. Save draft. Oh boy, this is painful. Okay. So I get tag 1, tag 2, tag 3, because these are real world tags I'm using. I'm going to add a featured image. I'm just going to select that and add it. And then once that all is good to go, I should be able to save this. All right. So now I've got 1,000 words. I've got a couple of tags. I've got a category. If I publish this now, I should be able to actually publish this. So there's some logic checking stuff in there. Yeah, so I'm not going to get into the code of this because I don't think I'm going to have enough time. But in the repository that I'm talking about, thank you, Victor. I appreciate that. Yeah, so it's in the plugin that I'm going to be sharing after. So, okay, so the next part that I want to talk about is, and this is, you're going to think I'm really brave here, because I'm going to actually try to write some code live. So I have, we're going to talk about some custom slot fill stuff. So let me get this loaded up here. I'm just going to rebuild locally here. I'm going to close this. And maybe I'll just have to talk through the code because I don't know if it's going to load. It's going to load quick enough for me. So let's go to custom slot fills. Oh, good. I have plenty of time. This is the fun part. So far we've talked about what's available. This is like what we can do already. But now we're getting into like the custom things, like how we can actually create our own slots, the ways that we can do it, customization things. So what I've done here is I'll take you through. I'm just going to simplify this a little bit and get rid of a few of these things. So you can see I've got a whole bunch of custom panels in here. So what I've done is in the custom in here. So I have defined a plugin document setting panel for each sort of example that I want to show. And then in my plugin, I have something similar. So I'm using all my slots. So this looks like a lot of code and a lot of craziness, but I'll kind of try to take us through it in hopefully not too painful a way. All right. So let me get that open. Okay. So let's start with the slots. So the most basic type of slot that we can use is, like I said, just having a slot. So you import slot from component and you drop it somewhere on the page and you give it a name. And then in your plugin, which is what this is my register plugin here. You just target the you target the slot with a fill component and wrap whatever you want to have appear in there. So that looks like this. Really simple slot fill. You can do custom slot fill, and yeah. Now the next one that we're going to talk about is using a new function. So we're using a function here called create slot fill. So create slot fill is a helper function. So if you remember that we have fills and we have slots and they both have names and they need to be connected and we have to remember all those names and do all that stuff. Create slot fill handles that for us. Basically what it does is it creates and returns a slot and fill component with whatever name is passed in here. So it's a really cool helper. So a pretty common pattern when you're creating a slot is a slot fill is to get your fill and slot, then create a new named component, and then have it take a parameter of children, which we've seen before, which is the stuff that gets rendered inside the fill, or sorry, the contents of the fill, and then wrap it in a fill thing. Now that's perfectly valid and super no problem at all. But the thing about that is that when create slot fill creates a fill, that's basically how it's going to work on the inside anyways. So we can streamline it even further by doing it like this, where we instead of just using fill as the name of the component, we give it whatever the name of our component is, and then we just assign the slot component to a slot property there. And just a best practice is to name the slot the same as the component. I don't know if there's any practical benefit for that other than readability, but that's sort of the pattern that I've seen. So this is how you're going to be creating your slots in a very basic way. This is how you'll start. You're not going to use the name slots. You can, and there may be times that you might want to, but this is going to be how you're creating the majority of those slots. So if we look at how we expose that now, so it's this one. So we have our slot field, and then we just say dot slot. That's the same as saying slot and then name and whatever that is. So that's functionally what that is. So it becomes a lot cleaner. And then in the, I need to be over here. And then in here, we're going to say whatever this stuff is, it's going to get rendered in there, and it's pretty straightforward. So if we look at that, you can see that we have a basic slot here, and it gets rendered wherever that is. So we've just basically wrapped some like syntactical sugar around the stuff that we talked about with names and slots, right? Or with slots and fills. But it looks a little nicer and makes you feel like you're hacking the matrix. So there is a property called fill props that we can use. So what we can, and it allows us to pass information to a slot. The only thing we have to do is handle that on the fill side, right? So this is the same slot that I've defined up here, but I passed it some fill props. In this case, I'm getting some current post information. You can pass whatever you want in here. And on, sorry, I'm going to close that down. And on the fill side, I'm commenting these out because they'll both render in the same place, and it's a little confusing. All we're doing is saying, okay, well, we're going to take props, and then we're going to look for those props, and we're going to display it. Now, obviously, we should be doing some defensive coding here, but for the sake of brevity, I just made it really, really simple. And yeah, so let me just see if I can refresh this in any length of time. So maybe while that refreshes, I'll talk about the next one. Is it going to go? Is it going to go? Waiting. Oh, man. Okay, there we go. So now we have fill with props, and it didn't render. Why didn't that work? Oh, maybe I need to. Okay, I'm going to let that refresh one more time, and in the meantime, I'll come talk about the next one. So that's a very basic slot fill that we're going to work with. Now the next one is so you can actually customize the structure of these fills, and we've seen that with the panel bodies and all of that stuff. And so the way that we can do that is pretty straightforward. So we can customize the fill structure okay. So we do the same thing that we've done before, where we create, we pull in, create slot fill, we create a slot and fill pair for ourselves right here. And then this time we're going to actually create a named component called customize fill structure. Again, we're matching the names here. Then we're going to take our fill, and then we're going to wrap a panel body in there. And now anything that goes inside this fill, anything on the fill side gets wrapped in a panel body. So if you put 10 fills, if you did 10 fills for customized fill structure, you will get 10 panel bodies stacked on top of one another. And let me just go back here and see if this is crashed. Is that working? That doesn't work. Okay, so I don't know why that didn't work, but trust me that I tested this thing thoroughly. So we have this customized fill structure now. So let's look at what we're doing on the fill side. So you can see we have customized fill structure here. So this gets wrapped in a nested panel, and then we're going to add a second one here. And you can add as many as you want. It doesn't really doesn't matter. You can add 10 of these things in a row. But each one of these is now going to be wrapped inside of a panel. So again, if we go back over here, you can see that this gets wrapped inside of a panel, and this gets wrapped inside of a panel. Now it's doing this weird CSS nesting thing because I'm making a panel shouldn't really go inside of panels, but I just needed a demo. So, right. So the next one I want to talk about is the other side of this, where we can customize the slot structure. And so the way this is going to work is anything that gets put in that slot will be wrapped. So if we look at this, we can see that. So we're going to create a slot fill, and we're just going to call the fill the name of the customized slot structure, and then we're going to say .slot is actually equal to a function, and then so we're checking to see if there's fills, and if there are fills, we're going to wrap all the fills in one panel body. So there's a subtlety there, and then on the plugin side, we're going to say this is so this one is in a panel. And this one will be in the same panel. So even though it's two separate fills, they'll both be rendered into the same panel. So let's take a look at that. And so you can see, so we have customized slot structure right here. So this is the panel, and this is the same panel. Yeah. So the next one is doing both things. So let's say we want to have a custom slot and a custom fill structure. And so let's take a look at what that one does. So down here, we've got customize both is what I've called it. So we can look in here, and we can see that we're creating the fill and slot components called customize both. And then we're going to create custom functions for both. So we have a fill. So I'm going to put each fill inside of a list item tag. And then I'm going to take the slot, and I'm going to wrap the whole slot in a panel body with a unordered list and some styles to make it actually show up in my demo, and front enders don't make fun of me for my CSS. Yeah, so this is a pretty contrived example, but you can see how you might be able to use this in like a plugin where maybe you've got add-ons, you've got like, so you have a core plugin, and then you want to add more chunks of text or more instructions or something like that based on the existence of other things. So if we look at that, it looks like this. So we have a panel, and then we have our first and second item. And if we inspect this, we can see that there's no crazy magic at work here. We see we have a list style, a unordered list, and then we've got a couple of list items. Okay. So the next and final example is one that's really cool, and it's called, I'm calling it inherit the icon. So if we wanted to have our plugin also inherit an icon, we have to do that. We have to build that out. So you'll see this a lot in the core stuff. I didn't include it in some of my slides because there's just a lot going on. But the idea is the same. So what we want to do here is we're going to use a higher order component called WithPluginContext. And so we need the compose function, which is going to add that to our function. I think it's a alias for flow right. Correct me if I'm wrong. Most likely I am. And yeah, so we have a fill and a slot. We're going to create our fill component here. And we're going to have a fill. We're going to put a panel body inside. So it's going to take a prop of icon. So we can pass our own icon, or otherwise, with the composed function, what we're going to do is with WithPluginContext is going to say, okay, if this component, if its own props has icon, if it's got an icon assigned to it or passed to it, then we'll use it. Otherwise, we're going to use the context icon. In this case, the context is the icon passed from register plugin. So if we look at how we actually built that out, you can see here that I've got inherit icon and just some text. I'm not passing an icon string or anything there. I'm not passing anything. I'm passing the icon down here. And then if all is right with the world, you can see that I have inherited my icon here. And I realize I have like 10 up icons stacked like crazy. So I'm sure the brand folks are cringing right now. But thank you, Greg. Yes, flow right from Lodash. Yes, straight from the man too. So yeah, so that's inheriting. So I've got about 7 minutes left. So maybe, you know what, there's something, I was able to create a custom slot fill system, like really, really custom. And it's a dashboard widget. And it's because this was sort of an experiment that I was working on. And so if I go to the dashboard, it's a ridiculous widget. It serves no purpose, and there's a couple of inside jokes in it. But I hope I hope it's worth it. So if this thing loads in the next 7 minutes, I'll show you. But otherwise, I think I'm pretty much, oh, here we go. Oh, sort of. Okay, so this is a custom widget. So I just registered a widget the way that I always would, any sort of custom dashboard widget, and I inserted a single slot, and then I've added a couple of components to pull this in. So this is nothing crazier than what we've all already seen. My experiment was more about like how, like, can I use this in other places? Because I can really see slot fill being like a really good use case for like a setting screen or something like this, where you wanted to add data based on your system, if you have more plugins or if you all that sort of stuff. So I'm going to just collapse that, and I will sort of show you the super basic dashboard. So if I look here, so you can see we've got a dashboard. Oh, well, actually, sorry, I should probably show the PHP first. So the PHP is pretty straightforward. All I'm doing is just doing the regular stuff that I would do. I am outputting a dashboard widget, and I'm just echoing out a div, and then I'm down here, I'm enqueuing my JavaScript. So in the repo, there's actually 2 JavaScript files. I have 2 build processes, one for the dashboard and one for the rest of the stuff. And so in here, the thing I had to do is basically enqueue all of the packages to get this thing to work. And then once that's rolling, nope, not there. Where'd it go? Sorry, let's get that open. Okay, so I'm pulling in all of the things I have. So I've created a slot. It's a very simple slot. Doesn't do anything other than what we've been super basic. And then I create a dashboard widget component. I wrap it in a slot fill provider. I put some text in there, and then I've got my plugin dashboard widget.slot. And then I'm actually able to render a plugin area. And this is everything just connects. It's awesome. I was super surprised. I thought I would have to write my own version of what plugin area does, and it works. And then all I'm doing is rendering that on the page and registering my plugin. And that's my custom, super duper custom outside of Gutenberg slot fill system. So I am basically done at this point. So I wanted to take a minute actually and say thank you to not only Zach and everyone here for having me. I had a great time, but also to the entire Gutenberg team and like Greg and Andrew and Riyadh and whoever else I'm forgetting. I'm sorry. They have been amazing in handling my ridiculous questions. And helping me through a lot of this information stuff. So anyways, I think I'm getting the boot here. So I just want to say you can hit me on Twitter at Ryan Welcher. Come check us out at 10up.com/careers if you want to do some really cool things with slot fill or just in general. It's a great place to work and a lot of fun. We have a repo that's live now called 10up slot fill and filter demos. I'm going to be updating that with a lot of what you've seen in this repository. And I'll actually just share the repo link right now in the chat for the stuff that you just took a look at there. So yeah, I think that's it. So thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the talks.
Awesome. Thank you so much again for doing this. This has been great, and I myself could have listened to this for hours and hours.
No, just thanks for having me, and yeah, feel free to reach out on any of the things if you have any questions about this. And the repo is public, so go ahead, take a look, and yeah. So thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you very much.
Means a lot coming from you.